to the God Conclusion. I'm your host, John Leonard. Greetings, listeners. Welcome to the God Conclusion. Today on our podcast, we have Lars Cade. And without further ado, Lars, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, my name is Lars. I live in North Carolina here with my wife and kids. I was raised in a very fundamentalist evangelical household with the Plymouth Brethren denomination, or semi-denomination if you're familiar with those. If not, don't worry about it. They're another evangelical sect. And as I grew older and started learning more about the world, I realized I could no longer affirm the tenets of Christianity. And I now consider myself an atheist. I don't see a particularly good reason to think there's a God. And hey, maybe I'll be convinced today. I'm always open to it. But one of the reasons I was invited on here is because I try to engage in a polite, if perhaps blunt, but nevertheless polite way with people with whom I disagree. Made a comment on your Facebook page here, and I want to get on there and do more than just mock. I want to engage with people and explain why I don't agree and maybe see if there's reasons why we can't agree. And so I think that's why I'm here today.
Yes, you are. And for those who aren't familiar, haven't been following recently, there's been quite a bit of a firestorm on the Facebook page for the last few days because I dared post a comment about quote unquote straight pride, not white pride. Good God. Pride, it was not meant to be mocking homosexuality. It was just meant to say there's nothing wrong with being in a heterosexual relationship. But as always, comments on the internet can tend to get misconstrued and cause confusion. But speaking of confusion, before we actually get started, Lars was kind enough to send me this document that compares 1 Corinthians 13, which happens to be the chapter of the Bible that we used in my wedding vows many years ago, and then uses examples from the Bible that he believes shows that the Bible actually contradicts what the passages in 1 Corinthians 13 says. Is that a fair statement?
Almost. I would say I'm using the actions and words attributed to God in the Bible, usually the Yahweh in heaven character, but also sometimes Jesus on earth, to show that these words and actions do not align with the description of love given by Paul in 1 Corinthians 13. Now, there are, I'm sure, times you can find where they do align, but my contention is that at the very least, they do not consistently align with this description of love.
Okay, that's an interesting approach. Again, getting a lot of preamble stuff done here, but to be very clear, I do not consider myself a Christian apologist. I do not consider myself an expert on the Bible, but I do consider myself a Christian, and I do like challenges. And Lars has offered me a very interesting, very intellectual challenge to try to defend Scripture against what should be or may be common criticisms that come from atheists. So,
Yes.
to begin, you quote, "Love is kind," and then you quote verses from 2 Samuel 6, verses 6 and 7, Matthew 21:19, just those two verses in this instance.
That's love is patient, the first line.
Oh, I'm sorry. You're right.
No problem.
I'm reading the words and I'm saying something completely different. That's not a good omen for this conversation.
No worries.
I do strive for honesty here and accuracy. Now, in this regard, this is a 7-page document, and I'm not going to be responding to every scripture verse and every point by point.
No
I'm going
problem.
to summarize and address each point as I see fit. And as I see it, you're doing a very common thing that atheists like to do, and that is you're cherry picking from the Bible to use verses, take them out of context, and sometimes to make a point that the Bible's not really making. If
I understand that's how I see it, yes. I would say that, yes, these are verses taken in isolation, and you absolutely should read the entire passage surrounding them and as much as possible learn about the language and context and history surrounding them. But I do think that you would agree that each of these passages describes the actions or words attributed to God in the Bible. Would you agree with that? Whether or not you agree with them,
they are, and that's one of my criticisms of this is you're trying to
apply
human characteristics to God. And God's love is way more complicated than human love, in my opinion.
That may be. However, my contention is that if we're going to use the word love and it has any meaning, we can't just carve out a new meaning for the God of the Bible. We need to look at what does it mean if I were to say, I love you, and then, as in the case of Uzzah, where I'm responding to love being patient, strike you dead for touching my favorite box, you would probably not consider that very loving. So, again, there is the context of the law given to Moses, ostensibly, where only the priests were allowed to touch it and it had to be carried on poles. In this case, the ark was being carried on a cart. And so it was done in the inappropriate way based on the laws in the Torah. But the fact is, this was a one-time infraction. There was no warning. There was no anything else other than Uzzah reached out to try to help. He was trying to stabilize the ark on the cart, and he was immediately struck dead. Now, if I'm comparing the word patient, which means to take some time before acting, then this does not seem to align with the description of the word patient. And in fact, later elsewhere in the Bible, in I believe it's one of the epistles of Peter, or attributed to Peter, when the early church was wondering why isn't Jesus coming back yet, since he'd promised to come back in the same generation as the people he was speaking to, it says God is not slow as some count slowness. So there he's saying that God is extremely patient, and yet in this instance, with no warning and no anything, with no warning and no consideration, boom, Uzzah's dead, just like that. And like I said, to me, that doesn't sound like patience. Would you say it sounds like patience to you if you were to hear of that particular instance?
That's a good question. And the answer is if you just read this scripture and only the scripture, I would tend to agree with you. That is the easiest and simplest way to interpret the scripture is, whoa, God's mean. He's doing something that's awful to this guy, Uzzah, and he shouldn't have done that. And again, I did not, in this instance, go and read all of Second Samuel to find out what was going on at the time when this particular instance or event happened. And
right. That's why I gave the context.
But the context doesn't really help if I don't read it for myself and determine whether your definition of context is valid or not.
You're welcome to do it. In the even broader context is that in this story, the Philistines had captured the Ark of Covenant in a battle, and after receiving several plagues for ostensibly holding the Ark in captivity, sent it back on a cart to the people of Israel, where it stayed for a bit of time, and then King David wanted to move it to the tabernacle where it was supposed to reside. Again, by all means, please check the Bible.
That's much better context than is in the document itself. That's very helpful to know. But it still doesn't tell me what might have been. Here's the way I try to read the Bible. When I read the Bible, I don't just jump to a verse and read it and say, okay, I'm done. I try to read in context. I prefer to study the Bible rather than read it. And when I read it, my first assumption is it's literally true. And I try to make sense of what is in it.
Then, can I ask why you have that assumption?
Because I found that when I take that approach to the Bible, more often than not, I find that what I'm reading is, in fact, literally true.
That's a whole other argument.
For example, I know we both have IT backgrounds. We both have logical minds. We both like to approach problems and have rational solutions to them. And I have to say, if you read my book, it's not like reading the Bible. It's more like reading a high school textbook or something like that. There's a lot of science in it. There's no scripture in it at all, except for in one chapter that defends scripture, like I'm trying to do today, against the criticisms of Richard Dawkins. And he did the exact same thing you did. He went through the Bible and he cherry picked certain verses to present case that his quote unquote God hypothesis, which he still to this day began with one of the most remarkable and offensive paragraphs I've ever read in the English language about how mean and nasty God is. And it's because he has a very childish understanding of God.
Perhaps, like I said, my contention is that even if you can find some instances of God being kind in the Bible, specifically compared to the passage describing love in 1 Corinthians 13, the character of God in the Bible does not consistently live up to those attributes. Now, again, like I said, in this particular passage, given the broader context, and again, you're welcome to go back and read the whole thing, double check, make sure I am correctly understanding the context here. Bear in mind, I have read the Bible completely through many times. I memorized big parts of it. I've preached sermons on it. I've led Bible studies. I know the Bible pretty well. I do not think I'm unfairly.
If I might interrupt you very briefly, I would say that I'm almost certain, based on what we've talked about so far, you know the Bible better than I do.
That is possible. So my contention, you could argue that I'm cherry picking these, and that's why I was careful with what I picked. I did look at the broader context of each verse that I chose to see, would it make sense to say that this aligns or does not align with the traits of love as laid out in 1 Corinthians 13. And I also make sure, for example, in the story of the conquest of Jericho, it describes Israelites going in and literally murdering everyone except for Rahab and her family, including the infants and the animals who've obviously done nothing wrong. But it does not say that God ordered them to do this. So I did not include that passage as one of these examples. I made sure to include the ones where it specifically attributes the words or actions to Yahweh or Jesus.
I appreciate that. Because one of the things I did note later on in the document is that Jesus himself said that not everything that's in the Old Testament is from the mouth of God. It's not from God. Some things in the Old Testament come from Moses, for example, most famously, divorce.
Yes, Jesus did occasionally refer to Moses and the prophets as distinct from the God of the Bible. And again, only if I'm referring to the prophets or Moses, again, we'll assume Moses is a real person for this discussion here. I'm making sure that it says, and Yahweh said, or often translated as the Lord said, then I want to make sure that's what I'm actually responding to here. Does that make sense?
Okay. Now, this is a very interesting conversation because as we talk more, there's more that I want to ask you about. You mentioned that Moses may or may not have been a real person. Do you believe that Abraham was a real person?
There's probably some real person on whom the stories are based. Archaeological and sociological and historical analysis suggests that there's probably at least 3 different main groups that came together to form the people of Israel. And the patriarch stories of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob were merged into a single family lineage to help these people unite under one banner. That's why, for example, you see my wife is too pretty, I'll call her my sister story 3 different times, twice with Abraham and once with Isaac. It's almost certainly just a popular folktale that got passed around, probably laughed at over the campfire, and eventually ensconced into the Hebrew scriptures when it was compiled during the reign of Josiah, and then later again during the Babylonian exile. There's no historical evidence of someone named Abraham. And for example, it talks about him owning camels at a time before camels were actually domesticated in that area. So there's clearly some folklore happening with that story. How much is history? How much is folklore? It's really hard to say, but I'm not going to say, no, there was definitely no Abraham, but I also can't say, no, yes, there was definitely an Abraham. Does that make sense?
Yes. I hear what you're saying. I don't necessarily agree with it. I think that there is archaeological evidence to a person named Abraham probably existed. or didn't exist.
I'd be very interested to see that, because I have looked into
Well, there's a well called the Well of Abraham, which, if you read that article that I sent to you after you sent me your document here, I was specifically addressing the story of Abraham and Isaac from Genesis 22. And Genesis 21 is half of that chapter in the Bible, is this story that goes on about Abimelech and Abraham negotiating about the ownership of this particular. And if you actually see and there is still to this day out in the middle of the desert where Abraham said it was in the Bible, if you go there, it's actually a very impressive structure. It goes well down into the ground. It's like a tower situation.
Yeah, like I said, there may be some evidence that's for Abraham. Bear in mind also that could just be a matter of tradition. There are many like standing stones in Europe which are said to be the sites of where fairies came, and I'm pretty sure you and I both agree that there were not actually fairies there. Nevertheless, they still bear those names today. Or the whole Canadian province of Saskatchewan is named for the Sasquatch or Bigfoot.
Look, I'm the first one to agree with you that there's a lot of miscommunication. There's a lot of intentional deception. In fact, in the city where this ancient well of Abraham supposedly exists, there's a second that's also called the Well of Abraham. But only one of them meets all of the criteria, and the other seems to be a more modern knockoff.
And it is possible that that is, in fact, the well referred to in the story. It is also very likely, given this of the time, that this story was invented or retold to establish some sort of legal claim to this well, so that when they have disputes, like legal disputes with their neighbors,
is disputed in the Bible.
Right, that's what I'm saying.
The second half of the text in Genesis 21.
Right, so they can point to their scriptures and say, hey, look, this is what our scriptures say. It means that we have legal claim to this, even though this was 2,000 years ago and we don't actually have any of those people now. Because that's something that, again, I'm not saying that it definitely didn't happen or that it definitely did. I'm saying the evidence is not very strong. It's not like the same evidence we have for Alexander the Great, who has more than a dozen cities all named Alexandria or something like that. But like I said, for the sake of our discussion here, we'll assume that the events are at least more or less correct. There's like, for example, when we're talking about David in this earlier story, there is one piece of archaeological evidence that mentions the name David at a roughly contemporary time. It's like a few hundred years after he supposedly lived, and it talks about someone from the house of David. Now, that to me, I would say that's enough reason to think there probably was a King David at some point who really existed. Now, do we know that this particular story happened? This is the only source we have for it, and it is written with an explicitly theological bias. I wouldn't necessarily say that the Hindu Vedas are accurately recording their God's involvement in their history, but I would still say probably some of the events in here are based on real history. It's difficult to tease out what part is history, what part is folklore, what part is mythology. But like I said, we don't need to argue all that too much. I think I made my case why I don't necessarily accept it at face value, and you've made your case why you do it, and that's fine. We'll assume for our discussion here that we are talking about events that actually happened in the Bible, right? Does that seem fair?
I would prefer that.
Okay, yeah, let's go ahead.
As opposed to just utter fiction.
Yeah, again, I am not a Bible scholar or an archaeologist, so I can't say too much more than that with confidence. And you're welcome to check all the claims that I'm making here too, to make sure that I'm saying them correctly.
Here's my take on it. Okay, just my 2 cents. The farther back you go in the Bible, the more difficult it is to understand what is being communicated. But it's foolish to assume, just because it's difficult to understand, that the story isn't true. For example, one of the very first stories in the Bible that I remember learning was a story of Lot and the city of Sodom and Gomorrah. And with the previous guest that I just had on here, we had a discussion about Christian marriage and homosexuality. And one of the things that his arguments was that the people in Sodom and Gomorrah were not so much being punished for their sexual attraction to the male angels. It was the lack of hospitality.
Yeah.
And
that is the
I've,
example given later in the Bible. Yeah.
I have heard that before. There is another example in the Bible. Plus, if you watch that movie Lone Survivor, where the 4 SEALs are over in Afghanistan or wherever, and they get caught, and 3 of them are killed, and there's just one guy left. And some of the locals take him in and show him basically the hospitality that is described in Genesis. You come on my land, I'll die to protect you. And that's a foreign concept to me, but that's what they believe. And that's what they live. And they still live it to this day. So
it's a
I don't think
huge
you
virtue
can
to them.
I don't think you can necessarily question the importance of hospitality in the Old Testament. Nor do I think you question whether or not Sodom and Gomorrah actually existed, because there have been excavations of the sites where they purportedly existed, and they found evidence of a catastrophic event that caused a local mass extinction in those cities and in that area that otherwise would defy description. Now, it involved a comet flying over that actually, I think, blew up somewhere in Siberia. And it was just the trail of this comet flying over. But this is actually documented outside the Bible in this artifact found called the planisphere, where they documented the meteor striking the Earth way back.
Those are 2 different events. The one in Siberia is the Tunguska impact event of, I believe, 1908. It flattened a large area of the forest up there. The one that is hypothesized, man, I can't talk today, to be the basis for the story of Sodom and Gomorrah was
it in Europe?
3 or 4
did I get that wrong?
No, it's in the right place. Like there is some evidence that would suggest some sort of meteoric impact or comet impact around the time that the Sodom and Gomorrah story have taken place. And it would make sense that indeed an event of that magnitude would be seen as a judgment from a god or gods. And
now, when it comes to the wife being turned into a pillar of salt, I'm still not quite to that degree of belief. But I believe that Sodom and Gomorrah existed, and I do believe that they were annihilated. And I also tend to believe that the lack of hospitality was a factor in this quote unquote judgment from God.
Yeah, perhaps. Again, I mean, that's one more example. I didn't even include it here of God doing something that were a human to do it, wiping out 2 entire cities. You would generally consider that evil. And so if the word evil is to have any meaning, it can't include genocide. Or rather, it must include genocide, and anyone doing genocide, regardless of their station, would fall under that category. People say God's ways are higher, or God knows the heart, or something like that. But that's just saying might makes right. That's saying God is the smartest, biggest, baddest, whatever. Not baddest. Smartest, biggest, most powerful. And so he gets to just decide unilaterally on these things. And yet, even when, for example, we have people who are convicted terrorists at Abu Ghraib, we still hold our people accountable for mistreating them, even though you could say they deserve it because they have done horrific, horrible things. We still say, no, that's evil of our soldiers to mistreat and sodomize those people. That's what I want to say. I want to say you can't just carve out special categories and say God doesn't fit these categories for humans. In that case, you're saying that God is amoral or immoral, depending on how you want to look at it. Either good and bad, love and hate have meanings in our language as we use them, or they are words, they are just arbitrary, and we just slap love on God because we say it's God and God is love. And I just don't think that makes a whole lot of linguistic sense.
Do you ever see the movie called The Time Bandits?
Afraid not. No, I think I've heard of it, but
I don't need to get into the plot or anything like that. I just want to make reference to what they call God is like my favorite all-time term, supreme being. Okay. God, if we assume for the sake of this argument that God exists, he's the creator of this entire universe. And coincidentally, science tells us that the universe had an origin. But it tells us that there was a point before which there were no stars, there were no galaxies, there was not even an atom. So if you want to
Yeah, sort
belabor
of.
the point and say that doesn't mean you can have this time that stretches before that started, you still have to have the catalyst that brings us to the point where we are today.
I would agree. That's actually a fair way to put it. Most people say, "Oh, the universe had an absolute beginning." It's not really
And
correct. That's a different.
semantic hair
It's a different
splitting
discussion,
thing.
though.
And I've had that debate more than once, and I've yet to lose it, but I don't know that I've ever won it. But I think I've made progress here with you because you agree with me that no matter whether you say that the Big Bang was an absolute beginning, we agree that there was a time where there were no stars, no galaxies, no atoms, nothing of what we can see and touch
Yeah.
today, observe today. And furthermore, knowing that, we also, by simple extrapolation, know that there was no life at some point.
That would be
So,
about 4 billion years ago. Would be the first evidence of
so,
life.
so, with that said, these are what, by any definition, would be called miracles.
No, not at
And
all.
oh, yes, they would.
No, not even
The
close.
art, the origin of life. If you've done research
I
on
have.
abiogenesis, I believe you completely. If you've done research, they aren't even close to
That's
having.
definitely not true.
They are not even close to coming up with a cell.
No.
They're not creating life. You're not going to ever be able to create life because that's when humans believe that they, with their arrogance, that they can step into the shoes of God. And I really think that we're probably coming to a point where we're nearing a point of no return, and God's about had enough of our nonsense. But I don't want to get into
No, just real
apocryphal
quick. I would
language.
be very careful saying that again in the future because it's not true that we have no clue. There are a lot of clues, and there are more clues available now than there were 50 years ago, 60 years ago when the Miller-Urey experiment was first conducted in 1953.
What progress has been made
Quite a
since
bit.
Miller-Urey?
Lots. That's what I'm saying. Lots of progress. We found that there is the abiotic synthesis of all 5 nucleotides, the A, C, G, and U. We have the formation of lipid vesicles, bilayer lipid vesicles, spontaneously in solution. There is the formation, again, of all the amino acids, the racemic, chiral formation of mostly left-handed amino acids on clays and crystals. There is we've even found that RNA can, in certain cases, reproduce itself and mutate and evolve and produce an entire ecosystem. That was an experiment recently released. RNA, it's a precursor to DNA-based life. Now, I'm not saying we know exactly how life formed on Earth, but when people say that it is the purview of God, for example, they are basically subscribing to the old superstition of vitalism, the idea that life is a mystical force, or the elan vital, which was basically disproved in 1828 with the chemical synthesis of urea, the first abiotically synthesized organic molecule. And since then, the field of biochemistry has been a very productive one. In fact, my wife has a PhD in it, and the entirety of that field is based on the idea that life is in fact chemical in nature and can be understood in that context. And it continues to produce results. So it seems to be a valid assumption. Now, it's true, we don't know exactly how life began. We don't know what kicked off the expansion of the Big Bang. But to call them miracles would mean that we can say for sure that there was some violation of the conserved properties of the universe. So there's like mass, spin, charge, momentum. These things are all conserved properties in our physical existence as we understand it. I would say a miracle would have to be something that violates those conserved properties. Otherwise, it is a physical event. We understand a lot about physics, and we can say a fair bit about what can or can't happen. And so if we see one of these things that we always observe as conserved not being conserved, I would say that qualifies as a miracle. It requires some sort of input from some source other than our physical existence. And since we don't have enough reason to say that these things had to require that, I'd be very careful in calling them miraculous, because at most we have an example of something that we don't know very well. And when you don't know something, you can't just then say that you do know something about it, such as that it has to be supernatural, it has to be divine origin. Now, perhaps it could be. I'm not saying it can't be. As I often point out in discussions about creation and evolution, even if the first life did require supernatural intervention in order to start, that does not imply that evolution is wrong, because the evolutionary theory only relies on the existence of some population of living organisms, as you've probably heard before. So even if the start of life was miraculous, although we currently have no good reason to think it was, we also don't have enough reason to think it could not have been. We just don't know. That doesn't necessarily have any implications, or no, it necessarily does not have any implications on the remainder of evolutionary theory. That's its own discussion. We could have that discussion another time. If we're talking about events that we can validate scientifically, none have ever been found to require a violation of the conserved properties of the universe as we understand it today. Now, again, I'm not saying that it's impossible. Perhaps it did involve such a violation. Raising the dead, or regrowing an amputated limb, or multiplying the loaves and fishes, walking on water. These would all require a violation of the conserved properties of the universe. So if they actually happened, I would say, yep, those are bona fide miracles. But all we have is the accounts in the Gospels, which were explicitly written to try to convince you that Jesus was in fact divine, or at least the Son of God. And so their authenticity is somewhat dubious for someone not already convinced that they're true. Would you agree that's a fair way to read it? If I don't already think that, yes, Jesus was the Son of God or is God, then I would read the Gospels and think maybe they're trying to convince me of something without a whole lot of backup documentation. Does that seem unfair as a way to look at them?
As a general rule, I try not to be argumentative and just disagree. And so, what I'm hearing as my mind is simultaneously running 1,000 miles an hour is nothing that's objectionable. But now I kind of need to stop for a second and ask you a question.
Sure.
And with the caveat that I've done this once before, and in retrospect, it was probably not the best idea. But this conversation that we're starting to have, this can of worms that we're open,
it's different
it's
conversation.
actually more interesting than the conversation that we were going to have, in my opinion, which is just cherry picking the Bible and nitpicking it to death. But I'm prepared to continue with this discussion if you want. But you're actually getting into what my book's all about. So if you want to change course and talk about this, say so, and we'll change course, or we'll stick with plan A and stay on the document.
Enjoy all these kinds of conversations. I think we're probably best, let's stick with the original one. You're right, we have gone a little far afield. And then if I can get a copy of your book, I could read it, and then we could have another follow-up discussion later where I talk about my thoughts.
I was going to say, you're getting a free copy of the book as soon as this is over, so that we can have this conversation again in the future. And I definitely want to continue all of this about the Big Bang and abiogenesis and natural selection, all that stuff. But that's a different conversation. So we're going to stick with what we started with. All right. We've been talking for almost 40 minutes. And I'm only on the first topic, and I'm only to the second Bible verse. That's not really getting off to.
Let's go with maybe one topic and one passage for each one, and I'll explain why I think it.
What I'm going to do is I've got some notes that I've highlighted, so I'm going to read the verses that struck me the most important, and then if you have others that you want to talk about, you bring them up, and we'll talk about them as well. Again, this is just a free-flowing conversation, if you will. But the second verse that you mentioned in the love is patient section was Matthew 21:19, which is the anecdote or the episode of Jesus going to a fig tree by the road and saying, never bear fruit again, and the tree withers. And that's supposed to mean that God isn't really as patient as the verse suggests he should be. Is that fair?
Yeah. Or just it is an example of impatience.
Right. Now, again, this is just my take on this. This is not any sort of an official take, but it's my opinion. Now, I'll ask you this. Do you believe the story is true?
No. The surrounding context is actually that Jesus was talking about the people of Israel basically rebelling against God all over again and being ready to be judged yet again. It's probably because this was written after the destruction of the temple, and it was written as a backfilling to try to explain why Jesus was prophesying that this destruction would happen. Elsewhere, there's a parable where he says, "Behold, the axe is already laid at the root of the fig tree." Right? It is, or the root of the tree, not fig tree in this case. So it's probably actually a sort of an internal parable, like saying, "Hey, Israel, you're the fig tree here. Jesus is cursing you, and you're going to be destroyed. Now, that said, the other time where it appears, the withering is not immediate. Jesus curses the fig tree, and the next day they're walking by and they see the fig tree withered. So, do I think it happened exactly as written? Probably not. Like I said, I have yet to see anything that signifies something that I would actually call a miracle. Although, like I said, I have given my criteria for what that is. So, if you can show it, hey, cool, I will believe you. But it's an example of an action or word attributed to Jesus or Yahweh that is inconsistent with the attribute of patience. Again, I'm not saying, for the sake of this argument here, I'm not saying that the God of the Bible never exhibits these attributes. It's just that if indeed God is love, as it says in 1 John 4:8, then, and God is not changing, right? God is not a man that he should change his mind, as it says, then we ought to expect that God is always exhibiting all of these attributes if indeed God is love. And since I contend that God is not always exhibiting all these attributes, at least one of those statements can't be correct. Either this is a bad description of love, or you can't say that God is love. Again, think I'm treating it unfairly, or is that a reasonable way to compare things? Because if I'm not, I don't want to make a bad case, and I don't want to make a straw man. Does that make sense?
No, I don't think you're making a straw man. What I would say is you're giving me a lot of food for thought, and I'm thinking about what I want to say next. And I've got quite a few notes that I wrote after this particular verse, but you've given me additional context of the people of Israel rebelling, and so I've got all that noodling around in my head too.
But that is a non-literal interpretation of that, held by some scholars, but usually not the evangelical literal types. So I just wanted to throw that in there as a possible alternative interpretation.
Again, when I read the Bible, I try to read it with the mindset, first and foremost, that what I'm reading is literally true. So when I read this, even if we can't go and find a fig tree that died back in 33 AD and document that that's the same tree that Jesus touched, and yeah,
that would be a little hard.
I'm with that with all the stories of finding Noah's Ark on Mount Ararat in Turkey or some other mountain in the nearby area and everything. And my take on it is, unless you have some physical DNA, biological evidence that shows all of these animals were in that boat at the same time, or some other evidence that you can use to validate the belief, you have to take that such evidence as a matter of faith, whether you believe it or not. You can presume that it's true and, oh, everything in the Bible is true, or you can presume it's not true and everything in the Bible is false. But my approach is I try to take evidence on face value and look at it. For example, the Shroud of Turin. I just posted an article about that this morning, and I knew the research team, the STIRP team back in the 80s had done the research, and they carbon dated the shroud, and they said it can't be the burial shroud of Christ. It's dated between 1290 and 1360 AD.
Yep.
It's off the table.
Yeah.
And that's not true anymore. What's happened? No, it's not true. And it's not true anymore. The guy named Ray Rogers, who was on the original STIRP team, wrote a paper in 2002, which says all of the findings were flawed, that the tests were okay, but they weren't done, they weren't performed on a piece of the fabric that was original. It was actually a repair that had been done. And so it gave an incorrect date. And he said further testing has convinced him that it's authentic. And I take a step back from that and I say, even if they found,
there's no actually validated.
There's no way to that. You'd have to have the DNA of Jesus himself to prove. It's going to always be a matter of faith, whether or not you believe it. But if you listen to the scientific evidence, it's very compelling in what it's telling us these days, because they're telling us that it's not a paint, it's not any type of a dye. And again, I'm getting off of our.
Yeah, I haven't done as much research on the Shroud of Turin. It's never
it's mentioned in the book, and you'll read about it. And
okay.
There are footnotes where you can go and read the documents, the scientific papers that say everything that I'm telling you. So don't just take it on my word. Check the footnotes and check my sources. I strongly encourage that. But back to the Matthew story, I think that the story is probably true. And I think that in the context of when in Jesus' life this is happening, he knows his days on earth are numbered. I don't even have to read all the Bible to know Matthew 21. That's getting near crucifixion time. So to say that he's impatient or he's upset, he's agitated, and he lashes out where he would normally never do something like that, I think it's showing his humanity.
I would agree, but it then is inconsistent with the description of patient. Either one is patient or one occasionally lashes out. If one is always patient, like I said, if God's character does not change, then he should, and if God is love, and if love is patient, then God should always be patient. So I'm not saying that it definitely didn't happen. It would even be based.
Forgive me for saying so, but you're kind of like the atheist who doesn't believe in Christianity because there aren't any Christians today that are Jesus, and there was only one Jesus, and I'm not even in the same area code, same zip code.
No, I'm not a Christian or a theist anymore because I took the time to examine my faith beliefs that I had been raised with and that I'd believed all my life to see if I could actually substantiate them with fact, evidence, and sound reasoning. And I found that I could not. Now, it doesn't mean I am closed to the idea. Like I said, I will read your book. If you send me a copy, I will give you my notes and we can have another discussion on it. And I'll say why I think or don't think that it's convincing or compelling. I'm open to the idea. When all we have is words in a book that can't be well substantiated, like you mentioned, there's no way to go back and see, hey, here's a tree that died at 33 AD of supernatural causes. I have only these words. That isn't enough of a reason for me to say, aha, the words must also be true, and I should dedicate my life to whatever is in this book, right? Because I could do the same for any scripture of any religion and find things that I do or don't agree with in there, or that may or may not be possible. But it takes more than that for me to believe, right?
This is the point of the podcast that usually gets me into trouble, is when people get me to say things that other Christians are going to perceive as being heretical. But my take on it is you could, in theory, disprove the Bible somehow. I don't believe it's possible, but you could come up with arguments to say, no, this didn't happen. This never happened. And I'd say, I don't care. I still know that there is a supernatural creator God, virtually certain of it. Just as certain as Richard Dawkins is that there isn't one. And this exercise for me, it started years before when I was in your position or very similar. I was an IT guy. I had grown up as a very immature Christian, but I went off to college. I learned enough to be dangerous. And I was not interested in Christianity. To me, it was an intrusion on my Sundays, where it was one of the few days I knew I could sleep in. And to me, it was an obligation to go to church. And it was going through motions that I didn't feel like were sincere in my mind. So
it was definitely sincere, whatever else I may have been.
I believe you, but I'm just speaking for myself.
Yeah, I understand. We all have different stories.
And I'm not going to get into the conversion story, but then years later, I was listening to the television, or actually had it on the background while I was working on a spreadsheet for a friend of mine. I was trying to help him get a business started. And Richard Dawkins came on television, and he said that cars and computers and cell phones are all intelligently designed objects, but the human body is not. And
there's no good reason to think it is.
I didn't know anything at all about biology, but I know enough about logic and reason to know that's a very dubious assertion. Most of the really good inventions that we have today are based on what are quote unquote natural phenomena.
All of them are.
We look at nature and we try to model it and mimic it. And then we give ourselves great credit for coming up with this invention that occurs in the world in and of its own.
Yes and no. I mean, some things are like wings, right? Wings have evolved at least for, let's see, insects, bats, birds, pterosaurs, and many other things that weren't quite true powered flight. Each, you see wings, right? They're everywhere. And so it is not surprising that we'd also try to do the same. But the integrated circuits that power the things we're using right now, that has no real correspondence in nature, or in, I should say, again, they exist in nature, right? Because they still use the physical principles of our natural world, but they don't form through otherwise natural processes. As far as, again, we could go into the design and evolution. I love talking about that stuff, but go on to the next topic for 1 Corinthians 13 here.
Yeah, I agree completely.
And also, just for the record, Dawkins is a jerk. I would not necessarily want him representing me or my views. I'd rather do it myself.
All right, now I think we can get into the meat of our disagreement. The story from Genesis 22, I prefer to look at the whole chapter, not just the specific verses that you mentioned, which are Genesis 22:2, and then I think it's 11 and 12. But again, the whole chapter begins with sometime later, God tells Abraham to sacrifice his only son. And
well,
Abraham
specifically says he tested Abraham, which is already a big red flag. If you're in a real relationship with someone, they should not test you. That is cruel and unkind right from the get-go. I didn't even include the first verse, which I probably should have. If, I love my wife. I am not ever going to tell her, okay, honey, to show that you love me, I want you to go smack our son in the face. Now, that's not even close to killing him, but that's what God does in this passage. He says, hey, Abraham, guess what? I'm so great. You love me? Okay, go kill this son, the one that I promised you, the one who's your only son, it says in the passage, because it was compiled from multiple sources. The earlier ones said Ishmael, and of course, Muslims say that it was actually Ishmael who sacrificed, or almost sacrificed. Regardless, that is not kind. A kind person never, ever tests the people in their relationship just because of their own insecurities, especially not if you're an omniscient God. But again, setting that aside, that is not kind. No one would ever look at that interaction and say, that is kind. Right? Even if, yes, ultimately he doesn't go through with it, but he still later rejoices in evil, as I mentioned later in the thing, where he says, you have not withheld your son, your only son whom you love from me. If I were then to praise my wife for smacking our son in the face because I wanted to make sure that she followed my orders, that is cruel and psychotic, and I should be put in jail, and rightfully so, and never see my family again if I did something like that. So again, if we're going to use the word kind and it is to have any meaning, that cannot apply to God in that passage.
Who do you think wrote the Bible?
Lots of different people, most of whom we don't really know about. The books of the Torah, Genesis through Deuteronomy, come from multiple different sources. They each have their own writing styles and ways of addressing God. Sometimes it's El, sometimes it's Yahweh. There may be more than two sources. You've probably heard of the documentary hypothesis. I'm not enough of a Bible scholar to know how well that's supported, but you can tell even in English where they're mixing up two different versions of the story, as in this case, where in this version of the story, Isaac is the only son. In an earlier chapter, Isaac and Ishmael are both sons of Abraham. Or like in the story of Joseph, where it keeps switching back and forth between which band of people took him from Jacob's sons to Egypt. It keeps switching back and forth between Ishmaelites and Midianites, and there couldn't have been Ishmaelites at that point anyway, because Ishmael hadn't had enough generations to actually form enough people to be Ishmaelites. But again, that's what I'm saying. That's how you can tell that it's compiled from multiple sources, or the same with the story of Noah's Ark.
The point of my question is, God didn't write the Bible.
I definitely don't think that. Even if you agree in inspiration, you agree that it says, like in I believe it's one of the Peter epistles, that God's holy men of God spoke as they were given utterance by the Holy Spirit. That's I believe the Christian idea of inspiration. But ultimately, the pen to paper was human, right? Like, otherwise, it would be very weird for God to say, "I, Paul, write this with my own hand."
I agree, and I will recommend another book besides mine. It gave me some insights into this. It was written by a rabbi. I think his name was Friedman. It's called "Who Wrote the Bible," and he talks about, in his opinion, the evidence shows, and it might be that documentary hypothesis that you referred to. I didn't pick that up when I read the book. It's been quite a few years since I did read it. But what he was saying is that just Genesis alone had at least 4 people that wrote it. There was
that is the documentary hypothesis.
Okay. And it was a compelling argument, in my opinion, because he said when you read Genesis, it gives you often two different perspectives of the same account. And the only way to reconcile that is multiple writers.
Yeah. The easiest way to do it is just switch out, like, take Genesis apart sometime. Look at the passages where it refers to God as El, or just usually translated as God in English, and where it refers to God as Yahweh, translated as the Lord in English. Separate out those two things and de-interleave them, if you will, and you'll get two distinct accounts that speak with a more consistent voice individually, but when edited together can seem a bit often contradictory, but at the very least not very consistent with each other. Like, for example, that's why in the Noah's Ark story there's the dove and the raven. The original story had a bird, and it got told two different ways, and so the editors during the Babylonian exile, trying to compile a Hebrew scripture to unite their people, just said, hey, you know what, we'll just take them both and put them together. We have a dove and a raven now. And again, this is what scholars studying the words of the Bible think. Even Christian scholars tend to think something along these lines. Now, that doesn't necessarily disprove that it was inspired. There's no way to prove or disprove that either way, but it is, like you said, it's a very compelling argument as to how it was put together. As far as the actual people, we don't really know. Like, the books attributed to Moses obviously couldn't have all been written by Moses, because they include his death, or they include things like this monument is standing here to this day, presumably the time of the Babylonian exile when it was compiled. So at the very least, we know there's at least some scribal inserts in there.
Absolutely.
Anyway, I guess we could probably move on to the next passage. Or do you want to say why you think that is an example of still being kind?
I don't necessarily know that I would describe it as kindness. I think it's consistent, though, because if you look at the previous chapters in Genesis, God makes a covenant with Abraham, and that's very clear. And
he does say, through Isaac your seed will be named.
That's spelled out in the text. And you have to remember, the Bible is a book where an entire generation of humanity is often summed up and discarded in a single sentence. So
I would agree.
So when there is more than a sentence or two about a subject, I say there's something to this, maybe more than meets the eye. And that brings me to the story of the well of Abimelech. Yeah, you might think modern day it's just a well and everything, but apparently back then, digging a well of this depth was not an insignificant feat.
No, even now it's not easy.
And they were in treaty negotiations, and Scripture makes it very clear that Abimelech feared Abraham's God. And Abraham, in the middle of the story, this negotiation says, by the way, this it's out here in the middle of nowhere. I'm claiming that because I originally dug it. Your men took it from me. And Abimelech's going, whoa, wait a minute. I don't know anything about this. And Abraham says, your men took it from my men. And I want this covenant to go through. So to make the treaty fair, I'm going to give you 7 lambs or something of that nonsense. Some nominal gift that if you say it's 7 pieces of livestock versus an even trade, I don't think it was.
Really. Well, it's extremely valuable back then.
Yes.
Out of curiosity.
Yes.
What do you think the Chronicles of Abimelech would have said about that same event if we still had them today?
I don't know that Abimelech ever knew he was swindled. But maybe he did.
Well, I'm saying, I think the Chronicles of Abimelech would have said, and Abraham's servants quarreled with those of Abimelech, and Abimelech's servants had built it first, but Abraham's tried to take it from him. And Abimelech agreed to buy them from Abraham for the price of 7 lambs. That would be my guess. Now, I don't know, but that is, again, how these things are written back then. We only have one surviving account. I think the other version probably would have gone the other way.
He sold it to Abraham.
I know. What I'm saying is...
He said bought.
No, the other way. That's what I meant. I'm saying if we had the Chronicles of Abimelech, they would have the roles reversed. That would be my guess. I could be wrong. But like I said, I think these kinds of things were included in the scriptures so that the Israelites could point to their scripture and say, oh, look, this is our sacred book. It says this. We have claim to this land, and you can't take it from us because our God gave it to us. But the people of the other group would say, oh, here's our scriptures, our sacred chronicles. They say our God gave us this land, or our people built this well. And it would still result in war. Now, occasionally it could result in treaty. Like if only one of them could present their scriptures and the other one's like, oh, I guess you got these ancient scriptures. They say there was a treaty. I guess we'll go with that. It might help settle legal disputes. If we don't always assume that it's literally true, you got to think about, what about the other people in this story? Now, again, did they even exist? Who knows? But assuming that they existed for the moment, if we look at the full perspective, like what would they have written about this? And given that it was the whole story is about a dispute over a well, and I believe there's also a dispute over a wall too, although I might be confusing two things here. We ask, why did they write these things down? And I think you and I both agree that it's so that they can show that they have a legal claim to it. My contention is that they just wrote it down that way as evidence that, oh, hey, we have this legal claim. Look, our ancestors 1,500 years ago or whatever, they had this, actually, no, it'd be like 1,000 years ago, I guess, from their perspective, right? They had this legal claim, and so it's still ours today. And that may have actually worked in treaty negotiations. I don't know. But even if you assume that it's meant to be recorded as literal, you also have to consider that the authors writing it probably had their own biases and interests at heart.
You're missing my point. I'm sorry, but
maybe I am. Sorry.
My point is, why is it even in the Bible?
Well,
what makes it important? Now, I disagree with you because it's not there to explain how Abraham came to possession of this well or to document his claim. Is to explain what's coming next in Genesis 22. It says the first three words of that next chapter are sometime later.
True. Again, would that not also be consistent with... Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Let me finish my point, please. Time later. Why sometime later? It's because God was giving Abraham time to reflect. He was giving Abraham time to feel remorse because God knows our hearts. He knows what we're really thinking. Even what we're saying isn't what we're really meaning. And when Abraham said, that was mine, God knows what was in his heart. God knows he knew he was lying. So to me, if you put it in that context, and Abraham was lying about that, which doesn't make him, it makes him a human being.
Yeah.
Just like us. And that's, to me, the truth and the beauty of the Bible is they aren't larger than life characters. They're all human beings. You've got drunkards. You've got incestuous people. You've got adulterers. Everybody in the Bible, except for Jesus, is, forgive me for the lack of a better expression, the scum of the earth. But
they're not all great. No, it's true. Especially like David. David is just the worst. He's a mob boss.
David is not a paragon of virtue, but he did a lot of great things. God can raise low people to high places.
I would recommend read the story of David sometime. See how many things you think he'd actually do good. I would say if you read it carefully, he's basically Osama bin Laden.
I'd like to stay on topic.
But yeah, that's another thing. You're right.
But back to Abraham and Isaac, it is counterintuitive. It is totally contrary to the nature of God. Everything that we're told about God in the Bible, he hates human sacrifice.
No. 2 Samuel 21. He demands it.
Demands human
sacrifice. In fact, that's one of the passages I cite later on in there.
Okay, let me go look that up real quick. 2 Samuel 21.
Verses 1 and then 8 through 9. We can read the whole thing, but if we run through 9, it's not that long. But yeah, he literally demands human sacrifice of the sons of Saul as a reason to stop the drought.
Okay, that's not human sacrifice.
Yes, it is.
That's turning people over for judgment.
No, it's not. These people, the only thing they had going for them, against them rather, was that they were the descendants of Saul. It doesn't say, okay, it says during David's reign, there was a famine 3 consecutive years. So then Yahweh said, it is because Saul and his blood-stained family, because he, Saul, murdered the Gibeonites. So the king summoned the Gibeonites and spoke with them. Now the Gibeonites were the descendants of Israel. They were a remnant of the Amorites. The Israelites had made a promise to them, but Saul tried to kill them because of his zeal for the people of Israel and Judah. David said to the Gibeonites, what can I do for you, and how can I make amends so that you will bless the Lord's or Yahweh's inheritance? The Gibeonites said to him, we have no claim to silver or gold from Saul or his family, nor would we be justified in putting to death anyone in Israel. So David asked, what then are you asking me to do for you? They replied to the king, as for this man who exterminated us, who schemed against us so that we were destroyed and left without status throughout the borders of Israel, let 7 of his male descendants, not him, but his male descendants, be turned over to us, and we will execute them before Yahweh, sacrifice to Yahweh, in Gibeah of Saul, who was Yahweh's chosen one.
You couldn't punish Saul at that point because Saul
was already dead. Either he killed himself or was killed by somebody else, depending on which version of the story you're looking at.
I think he was.
The king replied, it depends. There's 2 different versions of the story. Again, it's that multiple sources. One of them, he falls on his own sword to die, and the other he's wounded and then is executed by, or mercy killed by somebody else, who then David decides to execute.
David executes that guy.
Yeah. So the king replied, I will turn them over. Now the king had mercy on Mephibosheth, son of Jonathan, son of Saul, in light of Yahweh's oath that had been taken between David and Jonathan, son of Saul. So the king took Armoni and Mephibosheth, 2 sons of Aiah's daughter Rizpah, whom she had borne to Saul, and the 5 sons of Saul's daughter Merab, whom she had borne to Adriel, the son of Barzillai the Maholathite. Thank you. He turned them over to the Gibeonites, and they executed them on a hill before Yahweh. The 7 of them died together, or were put to death during harvest time, during the first days, the beginning of the barley harvest. So this is Yahweh specifically accepting human sacrifice.
You're calling this a sacrifice.
It's what it says it is. It is executing before Yahweh on a high place. That is, in the entirety of the Bible, that's how sacrifices are done.
It's a sacrifice is a ceremony.
Yes, this is a sacrifice. This is killing humans for Yahweh in his presence.
To disagree, because I wasn't focused on that in particular. I was more focused on the Abraham and Isaac story. Not that I'm trying to diminish that, but I feel like that is one of the most important stories in the Bible. Because because when I was a non-Christian or a fledgling Christian or whatever you want to call it, before I had my conversion experience, I avoided reading Genesis, especially Genesis 22, because it contradicted the nature of the God I wanted to believe existed, or so I thought. But when I read the story, not just read it, but when I studied the Bible and read Genesis 21 and Genesis 22 and Genesis 23, all in close succession, and spent a lot of time really trying to understand what the story is telling us, I found that just by reading through the lines and in between the lines and adding just a couple of thoughts for context, I could make the story make sense and be true and be consistent. Because if Abraham was lying about that well mentioned in Genesis 21, then he needed to be tested. He needed to be humbled for God to uphold this covenant that he's promised.
Again, I would disagree. Let's say there is a criminal, right? Someone has, they're a fraudster, right? They have cheated someone out of something else that they should rightfully have. Do we then say, okay, now as punishment, I want you to go kill your child, and then, oh, okay, psych, stop. We didn't actually mean kill your child. We just want to see if you do it, just to see if you'd obey the law. Now, or we could send them to psychological counseling, help them understand why fraud is not a good way to get what you want, and help teach them better skills for actually earning money. Which one would you say is the kinder way to deal with the infraction? The way that would actually yield.
You're trying to put this in a 21st century context.
I'm trying to put it in a human context.
In the 21st century, and there were no psychologists to go and have counseling back in those days.
But if
there weren't that many people on the earth.
If God knows the human heart, as he supposedly does, then he could also have told Abraham, and done thing with Abraham, show him the error of his ways, without also being incredibly cruel, traumatizing Isaac for the rest of his life, and traumatizing generations of firstborn sons like myself yet to come, who were afraid that their father would be called upon to sacrifice them at some point, and that their father would have to.
Was Isaac traumatized for the rest of his life? I didn't get that.
Well, he's probably fictional, but if he were a real person, he would absolutely be traumatized for the rest of his life.
That's an assumption, isn't it?
It is also an assumption that this is specifically related to the previous story and not simply just a narrative. And then you're adding your assumptions, but knowing that humans are humans, if my dad tried to kill me and then was like, psych, at the last minute, let's face it, I would not exactly trust that guy going forward. Now, I suppose you could argue that after that, Isaac doesn't seem to have much of a relationship with Abraham. There may actually be something to that. But in fact, that the rabbis often do interpret it as Abraham should have shown character and said, no, God. And God was like, oh, fine, at the end, you don't have to do it after all. But that's a different mode of interpretation. But either way, it reinforces the constant theme in the Bible that obedience to Yahweh is more important than morality.
Okay.
And that if you do what Yahweh says, that is, Abraham believed God and it was reckoned to him as righteousness. That it is righteous to do what Yahweh says, even if it doesn't make sense or would be otherwise considered evil. That is very consistent throughout the entire Bible, that obedience is better than sacrifice, it even says, right? Obedience is what Yahweh desires, not necessarily good deeds. There are some things that say he requests good deeds, but most of the time it's just obedience.
Well,
maybe I understand like this is an important passage to you, and maybe we could have a whole discussion on just this one. But again, my contention is that if the word kindness is to have meaning, then it needs to apply consistently, and that even if you're right, this is actually God specifically dealing with Abraham cheating Abimelech in the previous passage, which I got to say, I appreciate that interpretation. I had not considered that interpretation before, and it does make a certain amount of sense to me. Then it's still not a good way to do it, because again, we are talking about the all-powerful creator of the universe who can at will change someone's mind. He can harden Pharaoh's heart, or Saul to change his mind and become Paul of Tarsus. This is the kind of God we're talking about here. He doesn't need to put him through a traumatizing ordeal and leave you with the idea that human sacrifice might be something that you'd have to do to obey Yahweh. Because remember, he doesn't say it would be wrong to kill your son, or never sacrifice humans to me. I don't want that. He doesn't say that in this passage. He just says, okay, don't sacrifice Isaac at this time.
Okay, I'd like to offer a couple of hypothetical points and then ask a question.
Sure.
The hypothetical points are, if we assume that there is a God that exists, that we assume that he created the universe and that he created the life that's within it.
We'll go with all those.
You'll accept that on the conditional premise that it's just a...
Yeah, for the sake of argument, we'll assume it.
All right, so in that context, with God in that persona, do you think that God loved Ted Bundy?
Yeah, but...
Do you think he loved him less than Bundy's victims?
It would, based on the things that actually happened, it would suggest that he loved the victims less. Because again, we are talking about someone who could at any point intercede, stop Ted Bundy from doing his thing.
No, I would say that God gives us some tremendous gifts. The first and foremost gift is the gift of life itself. And the second gift is free will, that we have the ability to choose what we believe.
No, we don't. Absolutely not. No one can choose what they believe. You can choose what to expose yourself to, but it's literally impossible for humans to choose what they believe. To believe something is to be convinced of a proposition. I cannot choose to believe in Santa Claus right now. I cannot choose.
That was a poorly worded.
Yeah, sorry. That's a particular annoyance of mine that I hear Christians say a lot. So
you can choose between good and evil. You can choose between right and wrong. That's what free will means.
Yes, but again, God also has no problem in the Bible in interrupting that and at least nudging people in a particular direction or preventing them from doing a particular thing.
And I would say that there's evidence of that even today.
Then Ted Bundy shouldn't have done the things like, remember,
you're trying to impart your personal wisdom as the wisdom of God.
Yeah, I don't think the God character is wise at all. I think he's an idiot. But that's what I'm saying. That's my case, is that the God character in the Bible doesn't know how to do anything.
You knew a bit, and I have to get off topic again, but you knew quite a bit about abiogenesis and the origin of life, or you gave that impression. Are you also familiar with fine tuning and the Big Bang and all the constraints that are involved with that?
Yeah, the fine tuning argument makes no sense at all. It rests on
with a lot of evidence on it.
No, none at all, because it's based on the completely unwarranted assumption that the constants of the universe could have been any different than they are now. There's no reason to assume they could have been different. There's no reason to assume that they had to have the quantities that they had, and that God had a cosmic fine-tunatron that had to pick, here's the values I'm stuck with.
No, what you're implying is that the cosmic factors don't exist.
No, not at all. I'm saying that there's no reason to assume they were assigned. They are. We don't know why they are. They could be assigned. They could be not assigned. We don't know. And so to make any argument with the premise that they are assigned, that they could have some other value, or that the values that exist are specifically to produce sapient life 13.8 billion years later, that there's no basis for those assumptions. Furthermore, remember, we are dealing with supposedly the creator of the universe. He can pick what sort of constants he wants it to have. They can be any type of constants. They don't have to be the constants, even the set of constants that we have, let alone the values that those constants have. He's not constrained by the physical constants and then has to adjust their dials until he can produce something like intelligent life. Now, if the universe were a homework assignment in God's school and the assignment was, fiddle with these constants until you can get a universe that produces life, okay, then it would make sense. But I don't think either of us are going to say that it would make sense to say that it was a homework assignment in God school. So the fine-tuning the universe, like, yes, the constants of the universe do certainly have the interesting values, and they're precise, and because of those values that they have, interactions can happen. But there is also a wide range of values that could exist, and we could still get chemistry which produces life. Yes, if you fiddle with just one of them, that's one thing. But if indeed they are variable, then that means they can all vary together. And so there are a number of values that they could take. And I can send you documentation on this later if you're interested. A number of values that they could take.
I've read a lot of documentation on this. In fact, I've got a whole chapter in the book that talks at quite at length about this. And what I would say to you is that all of the people that I quote in my book, Roger Penrose and Martin Reed and Fred Hoyle and all these people that I'm quoting are not Christians. They're atheists, or they're deists, or they're agnostic, or what have you. They are not religious people. They're scientists, but they are saying that these factors, if you change them even slightly.
I'm aware that if you were to change one of them at a time, but if you change 4 of them at a time, for example, you can still get values that allow chemistry. But more to the point,
I'm sorry, but this is starting to get into some really intelligent sounding nonsense and gibberish.
The biggest problem is that it's assumed that they could have ever been different, and we have no reason for that assumption until we have a reason to think that they could be different. We can't base any arguments on that.
All right. We both have at least one common area in common, and that is that we both have IT backgrounds. And I try to look at things logically and rationally, as I'm sure you do as well. So when I started looking at this problem, I didn't just look at physics, and I didn't just look at chemistry, and I didn't just look at biology. I looked at all of them. I looked at psychology. I was reading Jung and Freud and these guys when I'm trying to understand the human psyche. I'm reading Rees, and I'm listening to lectures by Sean Carroll and all these guys when I'm trying to understand the origin and the nature of the universe. And what I came to is I have to look at the world. There isn't a spectrum. You can always bring things down to the binary level where it's a Boolean choice, true or false. And what I came up with is the universe is either planned or it is unplanned. And if it's unplanned, then everything that you're saying is true. There is no God.
That's not a binary choice. It could also be partially planned. Like I said, if it were homework at God's school.
No, a partial plan is a plan. A partial plan is a plan.
Okay, so like hypothetically, if there was a creator, the creator could say, okay, I'm going to roll the dice and create a universe with these values. Let's see what happens. I don't know what's going to happen. I'm not an omniscient creator. I'm just someone who can make universes. Would you say that is planned or not?
I would say if there is a cause, then there is a plan. And if something caused the universe to come into existence, it was according to this plan.
I don't quite get why a cause would imply a plan, though. For example, a raindrop falls and hits the ground. The cause is physics and the chemistry that brings the droplets together, and gravity falls to the ground. Would you say that is planned?
Ultimately, yes.
How would you then distinguish that?
Because it is part of a system that produces rainfall that's predictable up to a certain point. Meteorologists are able today to predict with a certain degree of accuracy that you're going to get rain tomorrow or not.
Yep.
They're not perfect, but they're better than they were when I was a kid. That's for sure.
That's ruined our plans for the weekend. We were going to go out to outdoor festival, but not going to happen now.
Sorry about that. I think we got a little bit. Actually, we're not that far away. I might need to check my forecast, see what we're going to be getting here. But at any rate, there is a system. Systems are intelligent entities that are created. They process raw data as input, and they produce information as output. And rain is a type of information that's getting fed back into the earth.
Yeah, I understand where you're coming from. I just, like I said, when I'm looking at an argument for or against something, the first thing you got to look at is the assumptions or premises contained therein. Would you not agree?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay. So when I look at the constants of the universe, we can definitely agree that they have certain values that seem to go out to arbitrary precision, right?
It's 1 in 10 to the 300th power is what Penrose
Again,
has estimated.
That's assuming they could have had
scientific.
random values, but we don't know that.
I agree. And
we know that like the proton has a mass ratio to the neutron, right? And that because of that mass ratio, we get atoms.
Penrose did the calculations and immediately started backtracking and coming up with cyclical conforming cosmology or some sort of nonsense.
Yeah, Penrose is a bit weird. I don't really like him very much.
I love him. I think he's brilliant, but he's very stubborn.
Yes, that's part of why I don't like him. He's not good at changing his mind when presented with new data.
Well, who is?
I'd like to think I am. That's why I'm not a Christian anymore.
Give it time.
Like I said, I'm willing to be convinced again. The idea that
I'm trying to get you back on that first step, which is back in the direction of believing that there is a God of some sort. It doesn't have to be the Christian God. And then you can dive further, which would be easy for you because you already know the Bible better than me, that you could say whether or not the Christian God is real. When I went through my conversion moment, I was having these thoughts at night saying, Jesus might not be any more real than Santa Claus and the Easter Bunny. So why do I believe in this guy? Why should I waste my time on this? And I just remembered Matthew 7:7, Revelation 3:20. They plugged into the matrix of my brain and rattled around all night. And I prayed and basically begged God. I said, I'm going to wake up an atheist if you don't do something here. And something happened. And
I did the same thing for years and it didn't happen. So,
well, I'm sorry. I'm sorry for that. I really and truly am, because I don't know what makes me special. I don't think God loves me more than you. And I believe, and I tell people that if you really just open the door to your heart and invite Jesus in, and you're sincere, maybe even need to be a little bit desperate,
many
looking
times
for it. Okay, I believe you.
Thank you. I appreciate that. A lot of Christians don't.
I try to understand why things are the way that they are. And I don't have all the answers. I don't even know all the right questions. But I like asking questions and I like looking for answers. And something that I wanted to mention, that you mentioned that there's no evidence of miracles ever happening. And I mentioned the Big Bang and abiogenesis, and you slapped that down pretty quick. But I've got another example that you could look into, and that's Annabelle Bean is her name.
With that one, I'll have to look into it.
Okay, there's a movie about it if you want the Cliff Notes version. But there's a book as well. It's called Miracle from Heaven. But the story of this girl basically is that she had 2 incurable diseases that were going to end her life prematurely. She had eating disorders. She couldn't process food in her body. And there is no cure for this disease. You've got bloated belly and you got to go through a lot of miserable experiences, don't have much of an appetite, and it's an early death. If not in childhood still, it's not going to be a full normal lifetime. And the parents were devout Christians, and they didn't understand why their daughter had this incurable disease, and they were going to hospitals and that sort of thing. Fast forward ahead, the girl has gone back home basically to die. And she climbs up into the tree, a limb breaks off, she falls inside of the tree, 30 feet, lands on her head. The EMTs get her out of the tree, and there's nothing wrong with her. Doesn't have a scratch on her, just maybe a bruise or two. Doesn't have a broken neck. She's not dead in the tree. Landed on her head. And then, sorry, I get a little emotional thinking about this. They took her back to Boston, and she was cured. And the doctor said, in medicine, we don't use the word miracle. It's a spontaneous remission, but you can call it whatever you want.
That certainly sounds like an amazing story. I haven't researched it, so I don't really know either way.
Yeah, there are amazing stories just like this, and not just in the category of a miracle documented in this degree, but there are NDE accounts where people form new memories while their body is in a state where they're dying or technically dead, and they form new memories that can be later tested by independent observers who investigate those claims and find out that they're true.
I have looked into those. In every case, the only sensory information they seem to have had is what's available to them directly centered around their brain. In some hospitals, for example, they would put notes containing like large written numbers on the on the backside of hanging lights, for example, where they could only be viewed if they were actually from above, because people often describe as seeing themselves from above.
You're talking about you're talking about the experiments that were conducted by Dr. Sam Parnia.
I believe
And the
so.
problem I have,
They weren't very good experiments, but
they aren't good experiments, and they aren't accurate in what they're trying to communicate or capture in these examples, where people are having memories or creating new memories of information that their body should not have been able to learn and process.
yeah.
There are a couple of examples that are in my book. One of them is a story called Pam Reynolds, and she was having an aneurysm surgery at the base of her brain. All the blood was drained from her head. Very well documented in terms of the medical records and very precise documentation. But I'll confess, because I like being honest, the guy who came up with the idea for all of this, or first coined the term that I like to use, which is corroborated veridical NDE information or perceptions, whatever you want to call it. His name is Dr. Gary Habermas. And I recently saw an interview with him where he said that Pam Reynolds is not the best example, that there are other examples that are even better. And he seemed to have some issues with Pam's example. But according to what I've seen, her eyes were taped shut, her ears were plugged, and there was a noise being constantly generated in her ear to distract her from being able to hear. And yet, in that condition, in that state, she was able to recall a specific conversation between the cardiovascular surgeon and the neurosurgeon that were both on the same operating team working on her. And she was able to physically describe the tools, the surgical equipment that the neurosurgeon would use, and described it as looking an electric toothbrush when it's a bone saw is the terminology. The imagery that you come up with does not translate to electric toothbrush, but that's what she claimed to see. And then when you looked at the kit, that's what you saw was a device that looked remarkably like an electric toothbrush.
Yeah. Like I said, I've heard such stories before, and I've not seen one of them that would convince me that a person had a literal separate from their physical body memory. Because even when you're somewhat shut down, the chemical reactions that produce your brain and the senses coming into it, those still happen. If your tympanic membrane vibrates, it's going to send electrical signals because of the way cells work into the brain. And if the brain is at least semi-functional, it could still form memories of that. Now, again, I don't know. I'm not a doctor. I wasn't there. I have not read the medical report. So I'd have to look into that more before I can say anything either way. But the ones that I have looked into, at least for me, I've not found as compelling reason to think that there is a mystical soul.
That's fair enough. But all I would do is strongly encourage you when I give you the book to follow the links, the hyperlinks.
Yeah, I plan on it.
And see the interviews that I watched and watch the documentaries, because I'm sure that the Pam Reynolds documentary is in there. And then there's one other example. I can't remember her married name now, but her maiden name was Michaela Roser. And she was involved in a very serious car accident where her brain literally sheared off of the brain stem somehow and twisted inside of her skull.
Yeah.
And it was nasty. But the EMT doctor, the emergency room doctor, happened to live very close to where the accident occurred. And they called him, and he was able to get there like that and gave enough treatment, emergency treatment, to get her to survive, to get to the operating room table And ultimately, she had a full recovery, basically.
That's
If you
great.
see her now, you'd never know that she had that type of a serious accident. And I've seen her giving her testimony in churches and things of that nature,
Yeah,
television programs. But
I'm not saying that people don't have. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
I was just going to say the interesting part of her story is exactly when she was in the operating room, her parents and her grandparents were allegedly in the hospital cafeteria. And the father, who was a smoker, said, "The stresses of this is just getting to me. I got to go have a cigarette." And her mother and her maternal and her paternal grandparent mothers, both of whom never had smoked a cigarette in their lives, both said, "Oh, we're going to go have a cigarette with you." And Michaela claims that while she was in surgery, that her disembodied spirit or mind or what have you was actually in that hospital cafeteria. And she claims that she overheard that conversation. And when she came out of a coma a couple weeks later, that's the very first thing that she wanted to talk about and
Interesting.
laugh. And her parents, her mother was just like, "There's no way that she could have known this. It's impossible."
Yeah.
Then you have to say, was there subliminal memories that her subconscious was able to smell the cigarette smoke and she heard these conversations in her unconscious mind and somehow it got recorded into her memories so that then when she woke up from this coma later, she was able to remember this, but it wasn't really a memory. You can always find a
Right.
way to cast doubt on any individual account. But my point is, there is a body of evidence, and it's getting thicker by the day, where they're doing research on all of these stories, and they're not all just anecdotes.
Yeah,
There is
that's what I have to
documented
see.
evidence.
Actual medical reports. And again, I've already given my definition for what I consider a miracle, right? Where you have some sort of violation of the conserved properties of the universe. The ones that we both agree have at least precise values. Whether or not you think that was deliberately tuned or just is, we would agree that these have precise values. I need to see something where those were violated in some way. And I would agree a mystical soul probably would qualify. It's just very hard to, as you said, it's very hard to actually demonstrate very well. But like I said, I would be interested to read more about this. When you send me out your book, I will read it and get back to you on what I think of it. Do we want to see if we can burn through the remainder of your notes on my document here?
We're never going to get through the remainder of your notes. I think we're only on like page 2, and there's
Let's do the highlights then.
yeah, we're going to have to be skipping ahead.
No problem.
You talk about, and I'm just jumping forward into love does not envy. Am I going too far?
Let's see. Yeah, we can jump ahead to that one. That's fine.
Okay. You quote Exodus 25 and Exodus 34:14, Nahum, all saying basically that God is a jealous God. And you're saying that's contradicted by the claim that God does not envy.
Yep.
And my point is simple. God has this problem. He thinks he's God. He thinks he is the supreme being. He thinks he is the creator of our entire universe. So the rules that apply to humans don't really apply to him very well.
Maybe not. But again, if the word envy or jealousy is to have meaning, then it needs to apply. And so, again, we could say, you're right. You could say God is amoral. God doesn't have to abide by morality. You could say that. God is not morally accountable. That's fine. But then you are removing these descriptions of love from God. They just can't apply.
We cannot get into the moral argument today.
No, what I'm saying is, no, obviously a deity could not possibly have anything to do with morality either way. At most, we could have its commands, and we could either choose to follow those commands or not, but that wouldn't have anything to do with morality. That would be obedience. But I'm saying, like what you're saying, the words that you're saying are that God must be definitionally amoral at best. Because you're saying these things, the human morality does not apply. That is the only kind of morality with which we have any experience or knowledge.
I think God is the definition of good.
And that's my contention, is that based on that definition, as we use the word now, something to be desired or worked toward or an admirable goal, these things, or at least love, as described in 1 Corinthians 13, does not consistently apply to the character of God in the Bible. Because you could say God is definitionally good, but, in another passage, I think we've just kind of skipped past it, and that's fine. But God orders the genocide and then sex slavery of some of the, I believe it's the Midianites. Specifically, we haven't skipped that. Sorry, that's later on. But we can get to that if we want. But okay, we can say, all right, that is definitionally good. But by any normal way in which we use that word, we would say that is not good. Like, if you're going to say that these things, that God does not have to abide by our morality, you can say that. But then you're removing him from the category of good. You can't have it both ways.
But again, you're trying to put God in human terms on a human level.
Yes.
And God is not on the human level.
Then you're saying might makes right. Do you think that might makes right is a valid basis for morality? If we do, okay, fine. Then I suppose we're in agreement here that God can just say, hey, whatever I do, it's good because I'm the one doing it. But that is what you're trying to tell me here, or at least that's what it sounds like. If God is to do something, then you're saying that thing, because God is doing it, is good. Is that what you're saying?
Saying that the Bible tells us what's good and what's bad. It says if your son asks you for a piece of bread, you don't give him a scorpion.
And you don't tell him to his own son. You don't strike him down for touching your favorite box.
You don't tell him to murder his brother.
But God tells people to murder all the time. He does it all the time, or does it himself. Or, like I said, the Midianites, where God says, take vengeance on them for something that happened generations earlier, wipe them out to a person, except for the girls who haven't slept with a man. Those you can take and use for yourselves. That's what it says. And so, okay, we can say if God tells him to do it, that makes it good. But then what meaning does the word good even have at that point? You could say it is godly. Okay, fine. If the word, like I said, I want to try to keep it focused. We've been going on a lot of tangents, and these are interesting. I'm really enjoying talking with you, by the way. I appreciate your curiosity, your willingness to actually consider a question, and your empathy. You're getting choked up with telling that story. Unfortunately, I see a lot of Christians these days that get so concerned about being right that they forget that there are real people involved in these stories. And so I definitely appreciate that.
In the conversation I just had about homosexuality, the guy ended up having me on the fence there saying maybe gay marriage isn't so bad. It's certainly better than promiscuous behavior, heterosexual or homosexual. Gay marriage would be preferable, and the state now requires it and everything. It's kind of like the whole Vogon. The resistance is futile. You will be assimilated.
The Vogons are Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy.
I get them confused sometimes.
That's okay. I appreciate the reference, though. Yeah, I'm a big sci-fi nerd. In fact, I think Hitchhiker's Guide is...
I noticed the Star Wars.
Up there. There's Hitchhiker's Guide right up there on my bookshelf.
Oh, yeah. It's on mine somewhere, too, but I don't even know if I could find it. In fact, all four of them were up there somewhere.
Yeah. If you're going to say that I don't have to judge God by human standards, okay, I'm not going to. But then that does remove him from the realm of what we call morality.
God is the source of morality. God is the source for objective morality. Hey, when we say that murder is wrong, you and I
because we don't want to be murdered.
We both instinctively know it's wrong because
we don't want it to happen, and so we say we're going to call this wrong. There's no such thing as an objective right or wrong. It's like an incoherent statement. It's like saying an objectively purple song. It doesn't make sense. Morality is just how we assess as good, bad, or neutral actions, attitudes, and consequences against what we consider agreeable goals and values, right? If we both agree, I don't want to be dead and I don't want my family to be dead, then we can agree murder is wrong. But we have to have that if first. And so you could say, sure, if Yahweh says it, then that makes it good or bad, right? If Yahweh says do this, then it's good. If Yahweh says don't do this, then it's bad. Okay, there's your if, but you still have to have that subjective if, right? You're talking about if Yahweh says thou shalt not murder, which is one of the commands, right? Then okay, that is Yahweh's subjective opinion. He doesn't want you to murder. And so if you agree with that, great, you are in moral agreement with Yahweh. But if you don't agree with that, and most people don't, most people do agree, it's not that it makes it right or wrong, it's that Yahweh is expressing his opinion. But the thing is, Yahweh is morally unaccountable at the very least, right? You cannot hold Yahweh to account for anything. He's not objective in the way that you and I are at the very least. You can't go out and measure him and touch him and get his eye color and find out his favorite movie. We're talking about his subjective whims, and he isn't human, so he doesn't share human values, presumably, or at least we don't know that he shares human values, and he can't be affected by human actions in any way. There's no way that I could, no matter how much I like flip the finger to God, there's no way I could do anything to him, right? I can't go up with a sword and be like Hercules and actually fight the gods. I don't think Hercules actually fought the gods, but Gilgamesh. I can't be like Gilgamesh and actually fight the bull of heaven, right? Can't do that. Sure, God can express his opinion, and if we agree, hey, that's an opinion I want to follow, great. But like another one of the commands is, you shall not take the name of Yahweh your God in vain. Who cares? You can't bind Yahweh. The whole point of that command is because people thought you could bind a god by using its name. And so he's like, don't take an oath by my name that would bind me to do something that I don't want to do. Even if we say that, use it more generally to say that you shouldn't say, oh my, then that has no moral component. I'm not affecting anybody in any way by doing that. That's just a command. No, I don't think you could say, even according to the Bible, you can't say Yahweh is the source of good. It doesn't actually say that anywhere in the Bible. That's a philosophical thing that's been added on by theologians and philosophers over the course of history. But it nowhere even says that in the Bible, that Yahweh is the source of moral good, or that there even could be something objectively good or bad. I just don't see, like I said, to me, it sounds like saying that song is objectively purple. It makes no sense.
All right, let me try coming at it from a different angle here. When everybody's favorite example of the worst supervillain in recent memory is Hitler, I like Stalin myself.
Stalin, Napoleon, Nero, take your pick.
Stalin starved 20 million Ukrainians to death in what's called the Holodomor, which is almost unknown compared to the Holocaust.
Yeah, it's terrible.
It was 3 times as many people, more than 3 times as many people.
Yeah. Lenin, because of his incorrect understanding of evolutionary biology, starved millions more. Did you know that? Because of Lysenkoism.
I probably knew it at one point in time in my life.
Yeah, it's the idea that instead of using selective breeding, you could use induced traits. By exposing seeds to cold, they would be better able to withstand the cold. No, they just die. When you expose the seeds to cold, they die, because that's not how evolution works. Evolution works by having the traits that are able to produce the most in a given situation to produce more than the others. But you can't give it those traits just by exposing it. But yeah, I agree. Lenin and Stalin, absolute monsters. And yes, they both were even worse than Hitler as far as the actual toll in human lives.
My point there is that with Hitler, history got a chance to punish him. History got a chance to judge him. He did not die of natural causes or old age. He committed suicide, and there was a sense that justice on earth had been served by the death of Adolf Hitler. We didn't get that with Stalin. Stalin killed 20 million people. He died in his own bed of natural causes. He basically got away with it.
Yep.
Because it wasn't illegal to starve people to death. According to Russian law, he could do what he wanted to the Ukrainians because he had power. And I like to tell the atheists that come to argue with me and talk about how Christians have murdered in the name of Christianity. I beg to differ. I say there's never been anyone who is murdered in the name of faith, or I shouldn't say that because there's Muslims, but there haven't been any Christians who murder for the sake of their faith.
Oh, sure.
They kill for political reasons.
There's plenty who murder for the sake of their faith too. Obviously, the Crusades is the classic example, but there's the Inquisitions, there's the witch hunts, and depending on how broad you want to cast the net of Christian. Did you see the Hulu series Under the Banner of Heaven?
No, I did not.
Okay, it's a fictionalized account of the real life case in 1984. Some Mormons who believe they were on a mission from God to murder a bunch of other people who they thought were not Mormon enough. And so, like, it does happen. It doesn't happen with the same scale and zeal that Muslims do, especially in the modern day. You're quite right. But it's also not fair to say that Hitler or that Stalin or Chairman Mao murdered in the name of atheism so much as they murdered in the name of the state or for their own personal gain. But either way, I don't think it's a fair comparison because, hey, people have always done bad things for bad reasons to each other. Whether they want to gloss it over with a veneer of, oh, we're serving our God or serving the state or whatever, they will find reasons to do bad things for bad reasons. It's more a matter of the ability through modern technology to do these things on such a more massive scale that we see millions dying instead of thousands like we did in the past. Because when you have atomic bombs or the ability to cut off supply chain to an entire country, you can just do a lot more terrible things than you can when you just have swords and pikes. No, I guess when we get to morality, it's also, I would say morality is ideally universal. It should be something that where you take all the humans, or if you want to go even further, thinking beings, if you want to include some animals in there, into account when making decisions. And like the murder of millions of Jews or starvation of millions of, you said, Ukrainians, right?
Yes.
Those millions of people are also millions of voices who were not being heard, who did not have their moral opinions considered or their moral value considered when making these decisions. It's not just, oh, Hitler thought it was okay to kill Jews or Stalin thought it was okay to starve Ukrainians, because that is their opinion. And they had enough people who were willing to follow their opinions that they were able to enact these things. But let's not forget, or the slavery in the United States and Europe, let's not forget that these people were also involved, right? I'm guessing the slaves did not appreciate slavery. The Jews did not appreciate the Holocaust. The Ukrainians did not appreciate the starvation. They did not think these things were morally okay. And so there was not moral agreement. Moral agreement comes from as many people as possible coming together to share values. My idea of morality is that we have goals and values. We can take them as like axioms in philosophy, if you will. We say, I value being alive, generally speaking. I value being healthy. I value being, give me a second. Sorry. I value my personal property. So we can say, okay, if we have these values, then we can say murder is going to be wrong according to these values because we value being alive. Inflicting harm is wrong because we value being healthy. Stealing is wrong because we value our property. Now, there are societies that have different values about these things, right? Where it's not even a thing in some societies, where it's just, hey, if this stuff is in the village and anyone can use it. We can argue whether or not that's a good society, but there are societies, generally fairly isolated ones, or purpose-built communes where that's the case.
But that's by mutual agreement.
Right.
What I'm talking about is the concept of objective morality.
Yeah, I don't think it makes sense.
That comes from God. Then explain this to me. There was a very primitive South American tribe. I believe they live in Ecuador, if I'm not mistaken. But they were called the Auca.
Yeah, the ones that Jim Elliott and Nate Saint and their crew went to see.
Yeah. Before someone learned their language, and spoke.
Yeah, there was a lot of intertribal warfare.
And shared the gospel with them. They killed any strangers that came in contact with them.
Mm-hmm. And
it was out of fear.
It was fear and generational grudges and things like that. Like the Auca and Waldani, I believe it was, they had different values. They thought that honor killing and revenge killing was a valuable thing. And then they were exposed to Western and arguably Christian values, or values that are included in Christianity anyway. And they were influenced enough to change their mind. They're like, hey, we can actually be more prosperous and successful by adopting these values instead. And so to say, like, that's what I'm saying. I just don't see how objective and morality can even be in the same sentence. They just don't make any sense to me. Like, if something is objective, you can go out and measure it. I can go out and measure the height of my tree in my front yard. I cannot go out and mine for morals, dig for morals, pick them from a tree, look at them with a telescope or a microscope. I can't pick up a collection and take it home. Morals are a way of describing what we like and don't like in behavior in ourselves and others. And they are always conditional upon a value, and a value has to be subjective. Like I said, it doesn't even make sense to me to say something is objectively moral or immoral. It's the words we use to describe behaviors that we do and don't like that advance our goals and values.
It's a context situation. If you can make up whatever you consider to be morality as you go along, that's subjective or relative morality. And that maybe adultery is not wrong for you. Maybe you and your wife explore open marriages. It's not something that I explore. That's a difference in opinion. But whether or not fidelity is better than adultery is an objectively more.
No, you can say, you still have to have goals and values that you're measuring it against. So you're saying if we both agree that trust in a marriage, call it fidelity if you want, is a valuable thing, then we agree on these things. But if people are like, no, I don't see the point of that, how are we going to tell them that's objectively wrong if they don't value the trust that you and I have with our respective spouses? Then how are we going to say, oh, well, that's still wrong anyway? This is, again, we're getting far into the weeds here, but this is why a lot of people in my camp are vocal in their opposition to what they see as Christian nationalism, where they're saying, hey, I understand that we have some shared values. Don't murder, don't steal, don't break contracts, things like that. We all can agree on these values. But then we have religious people trying to impose religious values that come from their religious tradition or scripture or whatever onto the national scene, where we don't have universal agreement on these things, or at least close enough to universal agreement that we can turn it into law. That's why people have a problem with it. I was sure you have a problem if Muslims came in and started imposing some version of Sharia law in the United States. If they tried to use our political system to turn our laws into Sharia laws, you'd have a problem with that, and I would too, right?
Yes,
Yeah,
I would not be
because
happy.
I don't like those laws. I don't think they are helpful or conducive to living a good life. And you can see that in how countries under Muslim rule tend not to prosper very much, right? People are less wealthy, less healthy, less happy, right? And but the thing is, countries under Christian rule, like especially when the Catholic Church and Church of England held strong power in their respective countries, they weren't all that prosperous either. It was as they separated church from state and allowed people to practice their religion individually that we actually saw an increase in prosperity. Again, I'm a big fan of freedom of religion, right? People have various beliefs and values, and they ought to be able to practice those for themselves, but to then impose them on others and say that this is objectively good or bad because my book or my religion or my tradition says so, that becomes an imposition on those who don't share those values. And like I said, the part of the values in the Bible are Yahweh commanding genocide and sex slavery. We tend to see those things as bad, and if someone tries to do those things, we often bring the weight of international force against them, right? The Muslim genocide that's been happening in China with the Uyghurs, right? Justly, I would agree, condemned by the international community as genocide. This should not be done. And yet, in the Bible, frequently, Israel is told to do just that, to wipe out these people because they are the wrong religion.
Do we know that was coming from God all the time?
Obviously, I would agree. I would say it probably wasn't. And much of it is actually mythological history, too. Archaeologically, the conquest of Jericho never happened. The whole conquest of Canaan never really happened as described in the Bible. The archaeology shows that definitely didn't happen. But
I don't think the archaeology shows anything definitely.
No, it does. Like we can look at Jericho and we can see when it was inhabited and when it wasn't.
I've seen the imagery saying that Jericho was not.
It was not inhabited at the time that Joshua would have been alive. So now it could be like
just think about that claim for a minute. How would anybody know exactly what Jericho was like when Joshua was alive?
Not that hard. By archaeological standards. Are you familiar with archaeological stratigraphy at all? It's where they go down through the layers and use various dating methods. Usually try to get as many as possible to get an accurate reading. Various dating methods to figure out when various layers, often of just trash actually, were laid down. And so like they can use carbon dating, they can use like coinage dating, they can use pottery dating, like various types of pottery were used at different times. They can use electron spin resonance dating on pottery that was fired to see when it was last exposed to sunlight. There's a bunch of different methods they can use to arrive at a fairly precise date for various things that happened through the archaeological record. Based on what it says in the Bible, I believe Joshua was, around like 1260 BC. Don't quote me on that. This is just off the top of my head.
I was going to make up a number if you didn't.
Yeah, but I want to say sometime between 12 and 1300 BC. And the city of Jericho, as far as I understand it, shows no sign of occupation during that time. It shows just dust accumulating as opposed to trash. Was there a conquest of Jericho? Probably at some point. Again, based on what it seems like the amalgamation of multiple patriarchs into a lineage as opposed to different regional patriarchs having their own stories, it's quite possible that there was some sort of conquest and it was rolled into the Joshua narrative. Again, I don't know. I am not a scholar or an archaeologist, so I cannot speculate much more than that. Or rather, anything I say here is purely speculation, not scholarly consensus or anything. So,
well, that was my concern. Was you were saying we
know? Okay, sorry, not anything I say. No, the dating thing. No, that I'm pretty. That I can be confident on. I'm saying I don't know where the story originally comes from. Is what I should say. That I don't know about, and there are probably people who have investigated it, and I have not read up on that particular story. But based on the dates that we could glean from the Bible, it does not seem that Jericho was occupied at the time that it supposedly would have been conquered. Based on the dates given in the Bible.
That's a little more palatable statement.
Okay, fair enough.
We know.
Yeah, but okay, we know with the same confidence that we know, like when Julius Caesar lived, right, that Jericho was not occupied during this particular stretch of time. That is indeed, assuming that the dates in the Bible are accurate and not purely numerological or some combination of those. It is also something that you see in the Bible a lot is numerological numbers, where these numbers are used not because they are meant to be precise as we use in modern English, but because they are meant to convey some kind of significance. Like the number 40 signifies a time of trial or testing. Does it mean actually 40? Probably not most of the time. But it's like the Beatles song, A Hard Day's Night, right? They're saying this is a rough time, and 40 is the number they would use for a hard time, just or like 1,000 is their generic big number, much like we use a million or billion in modern English. It's like, oh, it's like a million miles out of here when we're saying something is just not really remotely interesting right now. We don't really mean a million miles. That would take you past the moon, but we just use it as our generic big number. And so that's why, like, you have the verse that says that God owns the cattle on 1,000 hills. It doesn't literally mean 1,000 hills. It just means all of them or lots of them, right? And I think we can agree on that like when you have numbers like 1,000, that is not necessarily indicating a precise number, but it's being used symbolically of just lots, right?
Yes, we do agree. And the Bible says that to God, a day is like 1,000 years, or 1,000 years is like a day.
Right. Now, if it were written nowadays, it would probably say million, right? Because it's using the generic big number. Like time doesn't apply to God in their conception, right? And I would agree. If there's a God, time probably would not apply to it. I would agree there.
As it so happens in the philosophical model that I have of the universe, God is not part of this universe at all. God exists in another dimension or realm that we popularly call heaven, but it's the static parent universe of Sean Carroll's multiverse hypothesis.
It's one of those things where it's unfortunately so hypothetical that it can probably never be tested. Or so it really is more speculative than hypothetical.
We know that space and time have a moment of t equals 0, where in the Big Bang, there's that pivotal moment in time where before this there was nothing, and then material started.
No, I wouldn't say nothing. It's more that beyond Planck time, which is not quite 0, it's the shortest interval of time that we can describe. There's a state of extreme heat and density where the physics as we understand them don't apply. And then from that we have an expansion. But to say that there was totally nothing, that's one of those things that atheists often get really annoyed hearing, that, oh, you believe everything came from nothing. No, I don't know why the universe expanded as it did, or if there was a prior state, or if prior is even a meaningful term there. But I don't want to posit that there was a total nothing, as in the absence of all property or potential. Would you agree that's a decent definition of nothing, of the absence of all property or potential?
At one point in time, there were two prevailing theories or hypotheses about the nature of the universe itself. There was the
steady state.
Yes, the eternal steady state universe. And then there's Big Bang cosmology, where the universe has not always existed in its current form.
That we can definitely agree on.
If nothing else, we ought to be able to agree that the universe has not always existed in its current form. And then by extrapolation, as we go backward in time, we get to a point where all the mathematics and everything breaks down, and we don't know what was before that. And we can speculate, and that's where you get into the cosmic cyclical
that's where all you have is speculation at the moment. Maybe we'll find a way to test it sometime. But yeah, you're right. All we have at the moment is speculation. And that's why I try not to say, hey, I know why the universe exists, or I know why it doesn't. No, I just don't know.
When I use terms, or when I say things like the universe had an origin, the universe had a beginning, the Big Bang was the origin, however I word it, I'm trying to get at that particular point in time where nothing of significance, maybe virtual particles, but we don't know what it was, where all the mathematics break down. And then that point after which, where everything that we see and know today began to form. And so to me, it's asking the type of question, how many angels can dance on the head of a pin? You can speculate about this forever, but then you have to deal with the science that's involved in the implications of the universe having some sort of a beginning from a much simpler origin. And that's what Dawkins likes to do, is he likes to say, it didn't have to be as complex as the universe today. It started simple. Everything starts simply. And I'll go on and I see we're already well over 2 hours here. And so we're going to have to wrap this up here in a minute, at least for today. But I definitely want to get back in touch with you. And I'm going to be sending you a copy of my ebook as soon as we get off this call. And
appreciate it.
So, because this is the type of conversation I like having.
Same here.
That we don't agree, but you have a very interesting perspective. I'm equally bullheaded in what I'm thinking. And so it's like that clash of the titans almost, where maybe I'm a little bit boxing out of my weight class because you, quite frankly, the Bible, I would say, as well as most pastors, based on what you said. But then again, my whole point is I don't need the Bible to believe in God. I need the Bible to believe in my God, my particular personal God. So that's why in my book, I'm not trying to bring the Bible into it, or I'm doing it as little and as infrequently as possible, not because I'm ashamed of the Bible or I'm embarrassed about anything it says. I had another conversation with a guy where we talked about Jephthah. And that to me is one of the most fascinating stories in the Bible. And his point at the end of it was that Jephthah was not meant to be taken literally, that he didn't sacrifice his daughter. And I'm going, that's what a typical Christian like me would want the story to say.
It doesn't really say that, though. It doesn't quite say it either way.
It doesn't. It leaves enough ambiguity that it makes you think about it and makes you wonder. And then it goes back to that. If God abhors human sacrifice and hates what they do for Moloch and Shamash and these other pagan gods where they take babies and they kill them to honor this false deity in God's opinion, and that's anathema to them. And how do these stories be in the Bible and mean literally what they mean?
I would recommend you a little more research on the Moloch. I have also heard from other scholars that is not a god, but that it is a description of a type of sacrifice which would sometimes be offered to Yahweh or sometimes other gods. It, like in the times in the Bible where that is condemned, it is condemned that they are doing this human sacrifice to other gods, as you mentioned. And
are you saying that this is a ceremony and Baal is the god, or Shamash?
The Moloch or Molch ceremony could be performed to Baal, to Shamash, to Dagon, or to Yahweh. Now,
not Yahweh.
Based on archaeological evidence, it's not a guarantee. There is some evidence, though, that it may have been. I'll see if I can find some of the resources that I've read about that, and I can send those to you, and you can tell me what you think. Again, I'm not the scholar here. I heard it from other scholars. I'll have to check their stuff again. Like I said, there was also the passage in 2 Samuel where Yahweh specifically demands the sacrifice of Saul's sons. With Jephthah, at the very least, Yahweh does not intervene and say that you should not sacrifice.
I meant to ask this earlier. Were the Gibeonites also Israelites?
They were, according to the story, they were the people that Joshua and the Israelites had met in the desert, who had pretended to be from a farther off place and said, "Hey, make an alliance with us. We can see that you're conquering all these other people. Make an alliance, and we'll be your allies going forward." And so they make the alliance, and it turns out they were actually pretending to be from far off, and they were actually the next city over. But they'd already made the alliance, and so they had to honor it. But then they decided, we're not really going to honor it. We're going to turn you into slaves. We're not going to completely destroy you like God told us we should, because we also have to honor our alliance with them. And so that's the Gibeonites. And so, again, this seems like an ideological story of here's why we hate these people. Basically, it's a racist story of why we should dislike these Gibeonite people because they tricked us, or they tricked our ancestors, and they're living in the city, even though it's rightfully ours because our God gave it to us. And so in the previous story, Saul had come down hard on them and killed some of the Gibeonites. And so in the story with David that I read earlier from 2 Samuel 21, sorry, getting a little dry throat here. We do need to wrap up. We're getting just about worn out here. In that story, David inquires from God and finds out that Yahweh wants the sons of Saul punished for their father's actions against the Gibeonites because Yahweh still honors the treaty between the Israelites and the Gibeonites. Now, again, make of it what you will. Sorry, go ahead.
Why would Yahweh honor a treaty if he wasn't party to it?
because it's an honor-based society. And so a treaty, like hospitality, is more important than your concubine, for example, in the story in Judges that kicks off the Civil War. Or honor is more important than, like, if there's anything more important than obedience to Yahweh, it's honor, right? So if you make a treaty, and it says in multiple places, right, honor your treaties, honor your vows. So if you do that, well, you have to keep that command first before you even keep any others. That's why you shall take the name of Yahweh your God in vain is one of the 10 commandments, because the idea is that you could bind Yahweh into a covenant by taking his name. And so you better not do that flippantly. And this is, and again, I'm not a sociologist. This is just based on what I do know of the Bible and its culture. And there's, I'm sure, much more that could be gleaned from more in-depth scholarship on the subject. When I approach it without the assumption that it has to be all good or all true or all the word of God, and it could instead also have something to do with the political machinations of the time, I find it's actually a lot more interesting. I'm like, oh, okay, I get why they're having this here. Basically, oh, look, David has recently taken the throne, and he wants to kill all the male heirs of Saul so that they have no claim to the throne. Because this is a very common practice throughout history, right? Someone usurps the throne, and then they kill the line, like everybody in the line of their political rival. And so,
well,
after
look,
David says, oh, yeah, God just told me I got to kill these guys. Sorry. That's what it reads like now.
Yeah. After David lived, his own sons killed each other.
Oh, yeah, they were a bunch of schmucks.
But that, to me, doesn't speak to the mythology of the Bible. That, to me, adds authenticity to it. But
right,
it's
what I'm saying
describing
is it's
human people in a very human context.
And what I'm saying is, I think David was like, I need an excuse to kill these Saul guys. Oh, hey, what's this? Oh, there's been a famine. Oh, what's this, Yahweh? Oh, you want me to kill those sons of Saul? Oh, I guess I better do what you said. Again, is that really what happened? I have no idea. I'm not an archaeologist and I'm not a Bible scholar. But when I'm just reading it without the assumption that when it says Yahweh said something, that Yahweh actually said it, that it could just as easily be someone saying Yahweh said it. Because let's face it, all the prophets start out with thus says Yahweh, but who's actually doing the writing? It's actually Isaiah. It's actually Jeremiah or Obadiah or Nahum or whoever. It's not, there's no way to verify that these things where it says thus says Yahweh, that it's actually Yahweh speaking, because we can't go interview Yahweh and say, hey, Yahweh, did you say this at this particular time to this particular person? Can't do it. So if you read the Bible without the assumption that it has to be narratively accurate, or that it may be, just look at it as ancient literature. Are they perhaps interleaving legend and history? Like, I mean, again, you see this throughout ancient cultures. Julius Caesar had Zeus in his line. Did he really? Of course not. But according to the official Roman records, Zeus and Romulus and Remus were part of his lineage. Or there was a comet that happened to show up around the time he died, and clearly that was carrying his soul to heaven. Now, did it really carry his soul to heaven? No, but there probably was a comet, and so they took it as important. And so if you read the Bible as ancient literature, it takes on a whole different character. Now, am I saying my interpretation is the best? Not necessarily. But it certainly seems more plausible than David actually heard from Yahweh that he had to kill the seven of the sons of his political rival.
I hear what you're saying. And my only point in countering, I'm not a staunch defender of the Old Testament. I do try to stick up for what I believe is the veracity of it to some degree. But to me, the words of Jesus in the New Testament are what gives the Bible its real meaning, and that translates even today. And when I think of the story of the prodigal son, or the parable of the sower, or the judging of the adulterous woman, to me,
that Jesus was probably not actually original. The judging the adulterous woman was probably just a story added in later. Like, we know for sure that it was not part of the original Gospel of John. If you look at the scholarship on that one, like, most of your Bibles are going to have a little footnote. Like, yeah, this is probably not in the original. Now, does it mean it didn't happen? I don't know, but it was not part of the original Gospel according to John. It's a good story, better than a lot of them.
It's a consistent story with the nature and character of Jesus as the Bible depicts him throughout. So it's not like this anomaly where he's totally out of character and doing something that you'd never see Jesus doing in a million years. He's doing what you would expect Jesus to do, and exhibiting what I would describe as supernatural wisdom. Now,
how is that supernatural, though?
I'm sorry, but we're at the 2:20 mark.
Yeah, we need to wrap up. I'm sorry.
So I just want to say one last thing in closing, because I do plan on speaking with you again.
Great.
Fully intend that. after you've had a chance to read my book, and we can have more topics to talk about. But in the next conversation, I don't want to hear any, I'm not a Bible scholar, I'm not a sociologist. I'm not either. We're
enough.
two guys having a conversation about what we think and what we believe. So you don't have to qualify. I'm not an expert on this, or I'm not as much an expert as Joe Blow or whatever. We're just talking.
Fair enough.
So this isn't it's just meant to be a pleasant conversation where we try to come to some idea of common ground if we can find it.
Yeah, I got to say, this has been a very enlightening conversation for me. I definitely had never considered that interpretation of the story of Abraham and Isaac before as a continuation and specifically related to the previous passage as a reason for this inciting incident here. I like that.
Ask yourself, when an entire 50 to 100 years of humanity can be described in a single sentence, why would they talk about that for so long and give so much boring detail? I just glanced through that story the first dozen times I read it. And then when I'm doing the Bible study and I'm going through and I'm really agonizing, wrestling with each and every verse, trying to go, and then it still didn't make sense to me. And then I get to Genesis 22, and it was like that. I could have had a V8. So anyway, I've really enjoyed our conversation today. And I look forward to the next one. And thank you for your time.
Yeah, thank you.
All right. Thank you for listening to The God Conclusion. If you like this episode, please consider subscribing to this channel. Join us again next week as we continue to seek truth. Quid est veritas.